Ambassador Bolton, thank you so much for joining me. Now, almost a year to the day of the Russian invasion. What's your view? Could NATO have done more to have prevented this?
Well, I think certainly a lot more could have been done to deter the Russian attack. Uh, President Biden himself said on several occasions he didn't think deterrence was possible, that only punishment after the fact was possible. And I think that's a real contributing factor to the Russian decision to invade. I think we have to see it against the background of the utterly pathetic American and European response to the first Russian invasion of Crimea in 2014, which could have convinced any leader in the Kremlin that they could get away with it again. And I think added to that was the catastrophic U.S. and NATO withdrawal from Afghanistan, which unfortunately got a lot of attention, not just in Moscow, but Beijing as well. There were numbers of things that could have been done, including imposing sanctions on Russia when we saw the troop buildup along its borders. Many people at the time said, well, if we sanction the Russians, they'll just invade. Well, they did anyway. We could have been using the imposition of sanctions because of the buildup, but also better late than never for failing to sanction Russia in 2014. We could have put more arms shipments quickly into Ukraine, put more U.S. and NATO forces there to train and assist the Ukrainians. There's no guarantee that any of this would have worked, but at least if more weapons had been shipped in, the Ukrainian forces would have been better prepared early on. There was a lot more we could have done just generally politically, and I think this attitude that deterrence wasn't possible helped convince the Russians, mistakenly, but helped convince the Russians they would have an easy job of it.
You used that phrase, too little, too late there. Biden has been a bit more hawkish this week, but how would you evaluate his leadership on this issue?
Well, I think it's had its pluses, but there have been a lot of minuses. I think NATO has spent entirely too much time patting itself on the back. I still think there are weaknesses in the U.S. position and among several European countries, even on the actual anniversary date of the war. We still hear the American Secretary of Defense say that the statement of the objectives of the war is up to Ukraine. I think that feeds into the idea that we've just given Ukraine a blank check. I don't think that's true, but why aren't we willing to say what the official position of all NATO members actually is, which since, I believe, December 31st, 1991, when the Soviet Union disintegrated, that Ukraine and every other newly independent state should be in full control of its territory and have full sovereignty. If that's not our position anymore, I'd like to know it. And if it is our position, why can't we state it and then build a strategy to achieve the return of full territorial integrity and sovereignty? How much longer do we want the war to go on?
Should the NATO strategy include the provision of fighter jets to Ukraine?
It should have provided fighter jets to Ukraine on February the 25th of 2022. Let's be clear where the aggression is here. It started with Russia's invasion. So what are we holding back for? Do we want to extend the war? We think 1 year is not enough. We want a longer war.
There's fears of escalation, obviously, Ambassador Bolton.
Well, I wouldn't say obviously. I think that's part of our problem. We failed to deter the Russians. They are now deterring us. They committed the aggression. They committed the escalation. Is Ukraine to have its hands tied behind its back for fear of escalation? And by the way, where's the Russian escalation going to come from? Where's the hidden army of Russians waiting to pounce on a NATO country? And by the way, if they've got that army, why isn't it in Ukraine trying to do better there? This is Putin's part. And yet we have allowed the bluff to impede our delivery of assistance. That in turn has impeded the Ukrainian resistance and prolonged the war, prolonged the human cost in Ukraine, and increase the financial cost to all the rest of us.
But if Ukraine doesn't compromise on territory, and who could blame them, how does this war end?
With the Russian defeat. Why is that hard to understand?
Well, I think because people think there needs to be a diplomatic as well as a military solution, perhaps. Obviously, the Ukrainians have done much better than a lot of Western analysts predicted, and the Western world is cheering them on for that. But we've had talk this week, even from our own Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace, of this going on for another year, Putin saying another 2 years. How do you think this ends?
Well, why don't we get a strategy to achieve the objectives that NATO members say, which is they want the restoration of full sovereignty and territorial integrity. Now, if we're not willing to do that, why don't we come to grips with that? I just don't understand what's hard to understand about the importance of defeating the Russians. If NATO members want to negotiate before the restoration of full territorial integrity and sovereignty, let them say it publicly. Let's have a debate. We're wandering around in a cloud here, which has the effect of benefiting Russia. They know what they want. And now this war is no longer a European war. We've got China very actively involved, perhaps sending weapons directly to Russia, coming up with a peace plan, which, if you read it, looks even-handed on the surface, clearly benefits Russia in its specifics. And I would say today that although Taiwan, for example, is definitely under threat from China, the country most threatened by China today is Ukraine.
Yes. And I suppose people are also asking themselves, is victory in Ukraine enough? Doesn't Putin also have to be toppled? And how can that happen?
Well, I think it's pretty hard to see how we deal with Russia that remains under Putin after the war is concluded. And for those who say they want to negotiate with Putin to end the war in Ukraine, what Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris have recently said, that Putin and others are guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity. Explain how we're going to negotiate with war criminals, for example, about the New START treaty, strategic weapons limits, and peaceful relations in the future. If people are going to take the position that the Russians are war criminals now, there's obviously nothing to negotiate with them about.
I know you met with our own former Prime Minister Boris Johnson in the week, Ambassador. Could you let us in on your conversation? What did he have to say to you?
Well, I think he gave a speech later in the parliamentary debate that day about Ukraine and expressed his position. We talked a lot about it. He's still very concerned about the situation, and I think his government really was far more forward-leaning than the government of President Biden during his time in office. So again, if you believe that it's important to defend against unprovoked aggression, that it's important to prevail against such aggression, to deter the aggressor and to deter others later, why are we waiting so long to be effective? Shall we have a 10 years war? Shall we have a 5 years war? How about a 13-month war? How about if we start to move up and try and press this to a conclusion?
Final question on leadership. Are you putting your hat in the ring to be the next president of the United States?
Well, I'm considering it. It's a very difficult decision to make. I looked at it back in 2016. I ultimately decided not to go, but I think it's very important that Donald Trump not be the nominee of the Republican Party in 2024. I think he can be defeated. I'd certainly like to help out in making that happen. And if I think being a candidate myself does show a path to getting the nomination and to winning in November of next year, then I'll get in.
Thank you very much for joining me.